Just picked up your first video camera and looking to get some amazing footage? In this video, we're going to share with you 5 steps to master your camera basics so you can get some amazing video footage like this. Hi, my name is Jono, and by mastering these 5 steps, my best mate Jason and I were able to go from complete beginners who had never picked up a video camera before to being able to produce professional looking videos for our clients and running our video production company full time. So let's get into the video. The first step is to always shoot in manual mode rather than automatic mode. Shooting in manual mode will give you the most control over your image because you'll be able to manually adjust each of the settings that we're going to be talking about for the rest of this video. When you shoot in automatic mode, this allows your camera to determine the exposure of your image, and this can often lead to really inconsistent footage. So the second step to mastering your camera basics is to determine your frame rate. Your frame rate essentially allows you to shoot either in normal speed, slow motion, or ultra slow motion. The higher your frame rate, the more you can essentially slow your footage down in post. When Jason and I first started learning video, all we wanted to do was get those buttery slow motion shots because we thought that would give us the most cinematic footage. But when you watch movies, you'll actually realize that most films are shot in 24 frames per second. This is because 24 frames is actually what gives you the most natural looking motion, similar to what our eyes see. However, if you want slow motion footage, what you need to shoot in is 60 frames per second. And if you want that ultra slow motion look, you can shoot in 120 frames per second. This allows you to then take your footage in editing and slow it down. What we see a lot of beginner videographers do is they want to get that slow motion look, but they end up filming in 24 frames per second. What ends up happening is when they try slowing down the footage in editing, the frames start breaking up and they end up with choppy looking footage. So just remember, slow motion, you either use 60 frames per second or 120 for that ultra slow motion look. Now the next 3 steps focuses on how to get the right exposure, which is essentially the brightness in your image to be pinpoint perfect. And this is something that Jason will be covering.
Hi guys, my name is Jason, and the first component of exposure we're going to talk about is shutter speed. Now, the higher your shutter speed, the darker your image is going to be. Shutter speed not only affects exposure, but also affects motion blur. Now, to get the most natural motion blur, the general rule of filmmaking is that your shutter speed should always double the frame rate. So for example, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second or 25 frames if you're in Australia, your shutter speed should be at 1 out of 50. So if you're shooting at 60 frames at slow motion, your shutter speed should be at 1 out of 120. Sometimes in bright and sunny places, you might find it impossible to make your shutter speed double your frame rate. Now this is where you introduce something called the ND filter, which is essentially sunglasses to your lens. And what it does is it artificially darkens your image to a point where your shutter speed can double the frame rate. The second component of exposure is ISO. It is the artificial light created by your camera. So the higher your ISO is, the brighter your image will be. And you might think it's a good thing. Well, no. Because the higher your ISO, the more grain and static it will introduce to your image. So my general tip is to keep your ISO as low as possible. The third and last component of exposure is aperture. I find this the most exciting out of all 3 components. Now what aperture does, it controls the amount of light that enters your lens. The higher your aperture is, the darker your image is gonna be. What really gets me excited about aperture is that it affects your depth of field. And what depth of field basically is, it is the separation between your subject and your background. So the higher your aperture is, the more things in your image will be in focus. That means your background is not blurry at all. As you bring down your aperture, you're gonna find that the background is more blurry, and that means that there's more separation between the subject and the background. And this is also what we call bokeh. And the important thing is you use different apertures in different filming scenarios. So for example, in real estate, we like to use a high aperture because we want to keep the whole image of the property in focus and sharp. On the other hand, we like to use a low aperture for weddings because we want to put emphasis and focus on the couple instead of the whole entire image. So that means the background will be more blurry and it will make the image more cinematic. Typically, I like to use the lowest aperture possible to get the maximum depth of field. However, you might find it hard to do that on a sunny day, as a lower aperture is gonna overexpose your image. This is where you bring in the anti-filter, as its main function is to darken your image. This will allow you to get the correct exposure and also maintain your low aperture at the same time.
So those are the 5 steps you have to master to get amazing footage every time. Shoot in manual mode, determine your frame rate, and getting the right exposure through your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture. Okay, so now we're gonna go through each of the 5 steps that we just talked about to turn this overexposed image of Jason into a perfectly exposed shot. So step 1 is to shoot in manual mode. Step 2 is to determine your frame rate. Now, because this is an interview shot, we want to shoot in normal speed, which is 25 frames per second. Step 3 is to determine your shutter speed. So because we're shooting at 25 frames per second, following the general rule, we want to double our frame rate with our shutter speed. So we're going to set it at 1/50. So I'm just going to increase our shutter to 1/50, which you'll see will darken the image slightly. Step 4 is to set our ISO. At the moment, the ISO is at 2000, which is quite high. So as you'll see, the image is quite grainy and overexposed. As we mentioned before, we want to keep our ISO as low as possible. So I'm going to reduce that down to 200, which is the lowest that this camera can go. And you'll notice that the image now has become quite dark. So step 5 is to set our aperture. Now with an interview shot, I usually like to have the maximum depth of field. So we want to set our aperture as low as possible. At the moment, it's at 3.2. I'm going to reduce that down to 1.8. And there we go. We have a perfectly exposed image of Jason ready to give his interview. Say hi to the camera, Jason. Now, it might seem daunting for you guys right now to think about having to balance all 5 of these steps to get some amazing video footage. One thing that really worked for me when I first started out was to always try to jump into things when I wasn't ready. The first video shoot I ever did was actually when I offered one of my best friends in primary school to shoot his wedding for free. And at that point, I didn't actually know how to use a video camera at all. Jason had a camera, a Canon 1300 D. I couldn't even shoot slow motion. I had to shoot 25 frames the whole time. I had to quickly learn these 5 things so that I was able to shoot my friend's wedding the next week. Now, after that wedding, I got so much more confident with my camera basics. And if I hadn't forced myself to get out of my comfort zone and offer to shoot my friend's wedding for free, I wouldn't have felt that pressure of having to capture someone's lifelong memory, something that happens only once in a lifetime. I wouldn't have felt that push to learn my camera basics as quick as I did. So if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this video, it would be this: to always seek discomfort and get out of your comfort zone, because it is in those situations where you are going to learn your camera basics the fastest. There's no better way to force yourself to learn something when you're either paid to do it or when you're forced to capture lifelong memories with someone. And that wraps up this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video and found it helpful, make sure you give it a like and subscribe and turn on the notification bell button if you want to get notified of our weekly videos. On this channel, we're going to be creating videos about not just filmmaking tips, but how you actually use your filmmaking abilities to monetize it and start earning an income from your creative passion. Jason and I are also going to be starting an email newsletter where we essentially share weekly or fortnightly tips as we run our video production company full time. Be sure to check out our next video, which is how to create a video portfolio as a beginner videographer. And that's it from me, guys. Thank you so much for watching again. We'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.